I said, there it is. 10 o'clock, and we'd like to start.
Can we have your attention, please?
Go, girl. Take a roll.
Yes. Chair Barish,
Here.
Vice Chair Moschetti,
Yes.
Member Weir,
Here.
Member Angelo,
Here.
Member Miller,
Here.
Member Riley,
Here.
Sheriff Allman,
Here.
Member Diamond,
Here.
Member Liberty,
Here.
Member Myrtle,
Here.
and Member McGordy is absent by prearrangement.
Are there any members of the public that would like to express themselves? Please state your name.
Hi, I'm Michelle Rich. I wanted to bring up the issue of staffing for the proposed facilities, in particular the need to start preparing training for staff at facilities. The Behavioral Health Advisory Board, of which I am a member, has made a recommendation to encourage the local college and school districts to explore having a psych tech program as part of their career pathways programs, and we would ask, I guess I can't say that, I'm speaking as a private citizen, I would ask that the Measure B board consider that as well.
I think it's brilliant.
Thank you.
One more. Another one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, John McCowan, member of the Board of Supervisors. I think you're probably all aware yesterday we had an agenda item for the Board of Supervisors to endorse the guiding principles suggested by Kemper and Associates, the key policy decisions, and a proposed budget. So the board did unanimously adopt all of that. And this is a follow-up to the grand jury report, which really focused on construction of facilities. And when the board responded to the grand jury, we went beyond simply looking at facilities and pointed out that the Kemper report also called for increased and improved services for supportive housing, for substance use disorder treatment, for full service partnerships. And in fact, his proposed budget the first 5 years includes $14 million for those enhanced services. And the guiding principle of the Kemper report, based on, we have crisis services, we have very expensive out-of-hospital treatment or out-of-county hospitalization. We don't have comprehensive services in between, although we do have services. A lot of people are doing good work. They're not sufficient for the need. And so he recommends as a guiding principle for the use of Measure B revenues is the development of a comprehensive mental health services continuum in Mendocino County that provides a broad range of services and supports that remediate mental health conditions at the earliest possible time and reduce the need for inpatient psychiatric utilization. Now, we know we're still going to need that, so this is in no way an argument to not move forward with a psychiatric health facility, crisis stabilization unit, crisis residential treatment. But given that I believe we have money available, and I would also recommend, and I think the board added on to our recommended motion as stated in the agenda summary, that if we don't have sufficient data to determine how much, what are the gaps with substance use disorder treatment or full service partnerships, please ask us to authorize contracting to get the data that we need to know if Kemper's recommendations, if his proposed budget is accurate or not. But he does set a goal. He says it's not unreasonable that within 5 years following this plan, we could reduce the need for inpatient hospitalization from, I think it's 15.1 on average now, to 7.8, I think he called out. So roughly, you could reduce by half the need for hospitalization. Again, it doesn't mean we don't need a psychiatric health facility, but it will be a tremendous benefit to the people who need these services, their families, their communities, if we can also move forward with the other services. So I would encourage you to have an item on your agenda next month that would allow for a full discussion of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McGowan. So, Tom, would you like to have?
If you don't mind. Measure 3E, or item 3E is an article which everybody was emailed. And I'm asking the chair if we can move that to the top, because we have two Utah Police Department employees here, Chief and Captain, that I would like to have them go about their business if possible.
I think we should move it to the top and hear what they have.
All right. Chief Wyatt did distribute at our last law enforcement e-board, where all the chiefs of police and the district attorney get together to discuss issues of importance. And a very significant article was he brought regarding law enforcement industry trend of getting away from law enforcement responding strictly to someone who's going to kill themselves without a threat to the violence. And I know that our committee is very clear. We're talking about building and the brick and mortar and the disbursement of money towards improved services. But last month, the last two meetings, we've discussed the training center that, if you're interested, the escrow is scheduled to close next Tuesday, I believe on the 3rd, right? And I asked the chief if he could just briefly discuss the article that you have, and I would encourage you, and I believe there's articles being brought for the group here to take and read. But this completely changes a paradigm of law enforcement responding to someone who is threatening suicide, and they are not threatening violence towards anybody else, and there's not a weapon involved. If they're if they're in their house and they're depressed and they're contemplating suicide, certainly the statistics indicate that once the bell is rang and law enforcement responds, the chances greatly are enhanced of some type of violence happening, whether it's law enforcement using violence towards the person who's mentally ill, or the mentally ill using violence towards a law enforcement officer, possibly in an attempt to have violence to get suicide by cop. So Chief Wyatt's here to briefly discuss the article you have.
Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you to the board for allowing us to go first. And the Sheriff mentioned I'll be brief, and I will try to be brief. I have a fair amount of information I'd like to share, and again, thank you for giving me a few minutes to share that information. It's kind of what's happening in the law enforcement industry as far as use of force response and response to mental health. And so I actually did bring the article. I also attached some other documentation to it, if it's okay that I pass around. So I made 12 copies.
Are these the same articles we got?
The first one is, and then there's two other that you don't have yet. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to start off by, again, on the topic of training, so I don't forget, and before I go into too much other things, I want to mention that as far as law enforcement, we are, I believe, being trained to be better responders, especially to crisis and to people in crisis and de-escalation type of techniques. That training is happening. I think it makes us better responders to situations involving mental health cases, and I think that's important. But as I go on, one of the first things I want to mention, as the Sheriff mentioned, the AB 392 is the new use of force legislation. It was signed by the governor. It will become law on January 1st of next year. And there are a few important aspects of this law that I think are important. First of all, it really puts into law what law enforcement has been doing statewide already, pursuant to case law, and that we're paying more attention to not just the use of force as it happens, but how we got to the situation where we used force. What the officer knew, what he was doing at the time, and the tools and information he had, and how he arrived in a situation where he used force. And that's important because, again, case law reflects that, but this bill reflects that directly, and it tells us as the use of force will be analyzed in the future, that information will be a component of what is analyzed, and the questions that will be asked is, how did the officer get there? One of the important things that is written into this law is that a peace officer shall not use deadly force against a person based on the danger that person poses to themselves. And there's some more, but that's essentially what it says. In other words, this law tells us we are not to use force against a person that is only a danger to themselves. So the very obvious example of that would be somebody that's alone in a house that is threatening suicide and is not a threat to anybody else or anything else. We are already in this county and across the state contemplating and examining how we respond to those situations. The trend is to slow those things down, to involve mental health personnel, so that we don't, as the sheriff said, really kind of complete the process of suicide by cop. If that's what the person is intent on doing, they can use us to complete that act. So we are being more and more careful about analyzing how we're getting to that situation to where we may use force, and if we're making that situation better or worse. Again, we're already doing those things. We make more and more operation plans and evaluate our response to these situations. And non-response is always a consideration. It's becoming more and more a consideration and not responding based on the information we have. So that's kind of, in a very brief nutshell, that legislation and the laws that are affecting us that are causing this industry, I think, to really evaluate our response to mental health. That was an example of somebody in crisis, but that also transfers to the critically mental ill as well. We respond to a lot of calls involving people that are not in crisis necessarily, but may have a mental illness, and their behavior generates a call to law enforcement. There's always the potential when law enforcement's involved that force will be used. So again, this is causing us as an industry to evaluate our responses to those types of things. The very direct example given in some of the documents we have is that law enforcement simply stops responding to a lot of these things. In this county, I think across the state, we're not trying to change our response or our policies in a sense that we create a vacuum automatically that somebody else has to fill. We are having conversations and we're working with our mental health professionals and our supportive service professionals about what's happening in our industry, how we're evolving, and how we can evolve together to fill those gaps so there's not a vacuum in our response to the mentally ill. This kind of partners the conversations that we're having with the same professionals on the homeless situation and how that also is bringing attention to a transformation in how supportive services are delivered in the sense of meeting people where they are. So those are partner conversations that we, law enforcement in this county, is having with the service providers now. I want to say, as much as I presented a problem, there is somewhat of a solution here, and in your documentation I've included an example of a program called Cahoots. This is in Eugene, Oregon. Actually, Captain Kaiser and I have been looking at this program for a couple of years. I didn't realize until recently this is actually a program that's been in place for 30 years, and I thought it was something new, and it's not. It's been around for a long time. The documentation I provided, I think, explains it fairly well, but in a nutshell, this is a non-law enforcement response to a variety of things, to include mentally ill, homelessness, people in need. It's managed and dispatched through the police department. In other words, police dispatch receives the calls, they triage these calls, and if they fit the Cahoots model, then the Cahoots team responds to those non-violent situations that they can respond to. They're not law enforcement, they're civilian personnel. They have a team. The concept is basically an EMT and a mental health worker that teams together in a van. They respond to non-violent situations to include intoxication. They provide things like a ride to a sobering center or a ride to a case management area where case management is performed on the person. They provide support in the field. There are examples of this team responding to even people in crisis. Once the situation is stabilized, they assist law enforcement with de-escalating the situation. They respond to, another example given that I've examined is responding to a call of a person that was broken into. Their house was broken into. There was actually an intruder in their house in the middle of the night. Law enforcement got there, caught the person, but this person was still shaken up. They called Cahoots in, and the Cahoots spent 45 minutes talking to the victim and bringing some normalcy to that life again. So this is an example that is being looked at a national level. There are cities across the nation that are looking at the Cahoots example on how to improve response to specifically mental health and specifically non-law enforcement response. Oakland is one of the cities. I think New York, Indianapolis are some of the big cities that are looking at this model, again, for response to mental health. I think for the purposes of this committee, that probably the importance of this, again, is as important it is to consider the construction of buildings for delivery of these services. It's also about looking, and I think it's very important to look about how the services are being delivered. And again, I think we're at a point to where we need to evolve to where supportive services are delivered more and more in the field, and again, meeting people where they are. So I hope that was brief enough. That was kind of a very accelerated version of this component, but I am available for questions if there are any.
Thanks. I'm Jed Diamond. I've worked in mental health services for more than 40 years and was part of a crisis team that did similar things to that a number of years ago. And I just want to validate what you're saying, and I look forward to reading the report in more detail. And just recognizing there's many ways that a community can respond to mental health crises, and I'm really pleased to hear that we're looking at alternatives and ways to deal with that. One thing that wasn't clear to me from what the sheriff said in your report is clearly in any situation, if somebody has a gun, there's an immediate point of possible immediate danger, either the person themselves or somebody else. And that's rare, in terms of any kind of mental health. We have sometimes an image that mentally ill people are, violent. Generally, it's, very rare, but it happens. And it wasn't clear to me, how do you respond or how do you interact? And sometimes, I'm sure you don't know till you maybe even get there, whether somebody has a weapon. But how does this program relate to that contingency that's rare but of concern if somebody has a weapon?
And I appreciate that, thank you. And I haven't heard the presentation from Cahoots on how they evaluate that into the civilian response to these situations, so I can't speak with much detail about that. I think you bring up a good point. I think it's important to note that law enforcement isn't taking the example that we're just going to simply stop responding to these calls. If there's a threat to others or there's a threat to safety somehow, of course we're going to respond. Law enforcement is obligated to respond and to keep things safe. As far as the details on how safety is evaluated, I don't know that yet. I know that dispatchers would be required to be retrained and probably ask different questions in these situations that they do now. I'll give you one example that actually occurred to me this morning. As I was coming to work, I heard a call, and this is a non-crisis call, but I think it was probably a mental health call that would have been probably perfect for something like this. It was essentially a call to the sheriff's office where a female was alone at home and depressed, and she was threatening to cut herself. And that's the information that went out. Now today, we send an officer to that. We send a badge and a gun to something like that. With the right questions, that could very well be something that something like a Cahoots model could respond to. So, but thank you for bringing those up, and those are great questions.
Thanks for being here and sharing that. Appreciate it.
Ms. Ryder?
So thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
Is there any, Chief, is there anything that is actionable for us? I mean, you gave a very compelling story, but at the end of the day, is there anything that we can do to, like, is it the Cahoots is a program we should look at supporting? I mean, what can we do?
In a word, yes. In my opinion, I believe the Cahoots model is something that is worthy of more attention. Again, Cahoots is offering to this point to provide direction to communities, and I think they even travel and come to communities to provide what their example looks like. I think that's a great way to get started. I think having some municipalities and the supportive services together to hear what Cahoots is doing and how they're doing it can answer some of the questions that were brought up, and to see if that's something or a model that will work here for us and how that works. So to answer your question, I guess I think absolutely Cahoots is something, or at least that model is worth considering.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. I appreciate Ross's question. Also, we've talked intermittently at this committee about the need for preventative services and a question about if we're doing a better job of prevention, do we need as many beds as we're talking about building? And Kemper specifically states in the study that the Measure B funds are intended to fund programs that are addressing shortcomings in the service continuums. A shortage that currently exists in the service continuum is meeting people, as the chief said, where they are. And we've been working collaboratively with the county, I say we as the city, to try to develop a homeless outreach team that goes and meets people. And again, this is homeless, but there's significant overlap between homeless and mentally ill, but meets people out in the street to try to address their services. And one of the responses that has become an obstacle is that the caseworkers don't typically go out into the field. The social workers don't go out into the field, and that's where this work needs to happen, because otherwise the first responders are law enforcement, it's the police departments and the sheriff. So our police department has been evaluating this CAHOOTS program for a while. We've talked about it briefly with some of the county's HHSA staff. And I think there's real potential for progress to be made in crisis prevention through a model like this. I think this could potentially be a very appropriate use of Measure B funds. And I would like to advocate for researching that. If it's possible for the CAHOOTS team from Eugene, Oregon to come and give us a presentation, that's one way to do it. We might be able to have, I know later on the agenda we have our program manager, our project manager update. Maybe that's a person who can do some additional research, but I think this is a program worth exploring.
I totally agree that services and the silos that exist in mental health and how we approach it need funding. The one thing that I would ask, how would you feel if we funded all of these services and at the end didn't have enough money to have a psychiatric health facility and or a crisis residential treatment? Would we consider the Measure B funds utilized properly or not?
Is this something we?
That's a question for him. That's his, that's a question for him.
That's a big question, and I don't know if I can answer that. That's a big
Well, just
topic.
from the position that you stand, how would you feel?
I hope I never have to make that choice. You're basically asking, do I choose services or do I choose buildings?
That's what's being presented to us right now.
Well, I think if you forced me into a corner, the logical answer I think would be services. A building is no good if there are no services being delivered through it, or it's not staffed. But again, I think it's a huge question, and I'm not sure I can adequately answer it. In an ideal world, I think both are important, and I agree with Ms. Riley. I think if services are enhanced, if the delivery of services are enhanced and become more effective, there may be less need for a facility. And so maybe we meet in the middle. I hope I answered that huge question.
No pressure.
Yeah, right? Okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the way the ordinance is written, it's more or less mandated that we build facilities or facilitate the building of facilities. So I'm hoping that doesn't mean we have to make a choice. And I think there's always going to be a need from law enforcement or hospitals in particular to have a facility for people who can't be talked down out of crisis mode. So my intention was not to say that it's one or the other, but that it's equally important that we dedicate funding towards prevention and the improvement of services.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
But wait, Ross, I'm sorry.
Well, just one part of that the measure says up to 75% can be spent on brick and mortar. So the other 25% is required to be spent on services, realistically, or as we've done so well so far on consultants. But up to own, so there is money available, and it's specified by the voters that up to 75% can be spent on brick and mortar.
Yes.
I would just like to add to that, we need to be careful at the end of 5 years, this tax drops down to only about 2 million, 2.5 million a year. So we need to be careful committing to services now that will carry on past 5 years, plus have to staff and operate any facilities we build after 5 years. That's the number I'm concerned with by agreeing to do more services earlier than later.
So just for the good of the board, I have a strong suspicion that at the next meeting, we're gonna have a very robust discussion about this. So I think everybody hopefully will be prepared. Thank you very, yes.
Can the public speak?
Is that, yes,
Yeah,
go right ahead.
Okay. To Dan Anderson with Community Services, who, you know, we are running the crisis services for the county right now. And I really appreciate the conversations we've had with Chief Wyatt and Captain Kaiser on this. And so this has been a conversation that we have been exploring both with homeless services and with mental health services. It continues to be an issue for our crisis services of requests to be mobile. And we struggle with having the resources and the capacity to do that and still meet what our contract is to provide the services to the emergency rooms at the hospitals. We occasionally, when we can, do respond, and we had actually a call just a week ago where this was an urgent situation needing an in the community response for crisis services, and we had people there, and so we are doing this, but it's very haphazard. It's not coordinated with, you know, with dispatch. You know, the law enforcement departments don't know when we will and when we won't. We don't have a clear sort of plan as to what is appropriate for us. You know, what's the safety threats? It is very kind of inconsistent and somewhat stressful, because, you know, our intent is to help and support, and yet we don't have clear sort of directions on when we can and when we can't. And so it's keeping all of us a little bit off kilter in terms of trying to meet our community's needs, the crisis needs, support our partners in the law enforcement side of it, and make sure our community stays safe. So if there's a way to navigate this where it's a win-win, I think is really important, and we just keep figuring this out until it is a win-win. And from our crisis perspective, from our folks that are out there trying to do this, you know, we would love to be able to partner and actually be more mobile than, I mean, we're mobile to the emergency rooms, but we're talking about mobile into the field, into the homes and the streets and the community. So
For our information, Dan, would it be helpful to you to have a presentation by Coots?
would love to, and I read through the material I got from law enforcement. It looks like a wonderful program. I think there's some things that might not translate completely to our situation here, but it definitely is food for thought and gives us at least a place to begin that conversation. I mean, I had a lot of questions after reading that. Evaluating threats, there's, you know, what do we do with folks that need to go to a detox? I mean, there's conversations about that going on right now and so forth. But so there's lots of pieces, but this requires not just us or law enforcement sort of making uncoordinated stabs at it. It requires a really thoughtful, coordinated process, and I think bringing them down or somebody down would really love that. That would be really helpful to hear what they're doing, because it looks like a cool program.
Thank you. Ross, did you have a question for Dan?
Just briefly, you just said mobile services, and you wanted to see your services become more mobile and thoughtful kind of collaboration with. Anyways, are you talking like MOPS?
Well, MOPS is a first step on being mobile, but MOPS generally is not evaluating crisis situations. They're going in for early engagement. I think what we're talking about here is where it's a stronger mental health risk assessment. So, you know, you're looking at doing a 5150 hold. Actually, Cahoots is not so much that. They actually pass it off to folks that do the 5150s at the emergency rooms. It's a little bit, I don't know, that's what I'm saying. I don't think that program necessarily does what we want to do here.
They're first responders.
They're first responders. They still have mental health folks that have evaluated do 5150s at the emergency room. So it's at least that's what I read. And course, I'm just reading, I haven't talked to them. But I think what we're talking about, the need here, is that somebody actually could go in and do a psychiatric evaluation, an emergency psychiatric evaluation, do a fidelity hold, transport them, to this crisis stabilization unit.
You're talking about like what Chief Wyatt said about meeting people where they are.
Yeah, but you gotta be able to have the whole spectrum, then you can't go in and say, oops, we didn't prepare for that, so, which does include substance use, detox, being able to put somebody on a hold, the whole gamut.
Thank you.
I don't know.
I'm sorry,
Add to that?
Oh,
Ms. Miller?
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quick, this model looks really good, so I don't want to say it doesn't. But I agree a little bit with Dan in that if we were to look at a model like this, there are programs out there. City and County of San Francisco has a mobile team. I was part of that mobile team. We went out with a prescriber and a mental health clinician so we could prescribe on site to reduce hospitalization. So there's a lot of different models. So my thing is, if we're going to look at one model as a group, we talk about services, we should be looking at the spectrum of models, because it sounds like a great model, and I'm not saying it doesn't, but one of the things we could do in the City and County of San Francisco is we did 5150, we did transport, but we could prescribe on site. And that reduced a lot of hospitalizations. So I think there's other models to consider too.
Yes, sir.
So I'll just add to both conversations, I guess. Bringing back to the call I heard this morning, if in fact that was the call that it was, I could envision, my impression is the Cahoots team could go out by themselves, evaluate that gal, and transport her to the hospital for 5150 if that was the case.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other comments? No?
Here.
Oh, yes, yes, sir.
Hi, John Wetzler, citizen from Little River. I'm concerned about this discussion. I'm not really prepared to present what I'm going to say. I don't have the data with me, but I do a lot of reading about mental health, county, state, and nationwide. And if anything, my reading tells me is that the incidence of mental health, seriously mentally ill, the acuity is rising throughout the nation. Not descending. I called Lee Kemper about this situation, and he said it was a hope that the use of interdiction earlier in a patient's life. Obviously, that's good, but we still have to look at this huge increase in severity and the incidence of mental health throughout the nation. Thank you.
Seeing no desire for further comment, I'd like to go back to number 3A. Mr. Polizzi, discussion and possible action requiring expenditure report on measured free tax funds. Is that Mr. Weir?
Yes. So you should all have this in your packet. Current month's Mental Health Treatment Act, Measure B Fund Expense Revenue Report. We have through July now. Notice July's amount was quite a bit increased from June's. And so we have now a running total of $9,552,363 in revenue tax proceeds. Our expenses haven't changed since last month. They are still at a total of $230,437. So down at the bottom, you can see the life-to-date revenue, life-to-date expense, and then we have one more quarter of interest earnings in there now from the previous report. So it's total interest of $69,570. Today's balance is $9,391,496. And that's my report.
Thank you very much. Is there any public expression?
Sure. We did agree to allocate funding to the MOPS program, right? But we're not seeing any of those expenses yet. The MOPS program? Why isn't that hitting the budget yet?
As far as I know, nothing's been presented to us for caution on that.
Yes, sir. Mr. Miller.
So I have been in touch with Human Resources, and they're certainly the inability to hire the people is there. I think once people get online and been hired and out there working, then that's when Measure B will see those costs. But as for now, mental health and sheriff's office is absorbing the original cost. So the additional people haven't been hired yet.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayor.
What's Sarah Riley performing? What construction services is she
Is that
providing?
lady on the phone?
Right.
Yeah, but what is she doing currently?
Sorry.
It
It
is
is
Sally?
It's Sally, but her
No,
real
Sarah.
name is
I was
Sarah.
thinking-
Her real name is Sarah. It's one of those interesting. Chanel
Okay,
Rao,
got
sorry.
it.
Sally Riley's been on contract with the county for a number of years. She provides oversight on uniform construction cost accounting and any of the construction industry standards. So she's an industry expert and guides the county and any of our related agencies on competitive processing, ensuring that we're in compliance, and that's her role in this.
So she's helped you put the RFP together?
She helped put it together. She's going to help with the evaluation process and then be on board if we need anything after that. But beyond that, for this specific purpose, would be
Moving on to item 3B, approval of the minutes.
I would like to move that we approve the minutes with one small typo being fixed on page 3G. If I remember, line 2, word 1.
With that direction, is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries.
It's very contemporary.
Correction.
Kempery.
Campery and Kemper. It's just a little typo.
Okay.
You're a good girl. You find out some things.
Okay, next to Carmel, discussion possible action regarding update on Measure B project manager.
The update is we did an interview process. We had multiple candidates. We interviewed, we would say approximately 8, I don't recall, with an interview panel that included members of this committee, mental health staff, the sheriff and myself. And we had 2 top candidates. On behalf of the county, I made an offer to the top candidate, and the top candidate came back and wanted additional money and also reviewed the county job classifications and came back with a classification that the candidate thought the position should be rather than the classification that we had already agreed to. So at that point, I did not feel like it was the proper thing to do to come back to the committee and ask to increase the salary. For those of you that don't know, the salary for this position is $80,000 a year plus benefits. So ultimately, you're looking at about $130,000 a year, thereabouts. So that was not a job match. The second candidate, who was also a good candidate, we called and offered her the position. She had 2 other offers, and she opted to take one of the other offers. That had nothing to do with the salary on the job. She actually got a counter offer from her current employer. So the position is posted again. There are approximately 4 candidates right now who, the applications are on my desk. I haven't looked at them yet because they were delivered when I was in this meeting. And so we will be doing another interview process here within the next few weeks. And I just want to say, because I think there were, I have heard comments about, if it was just a matter of money, would the Measure B committee want to go ahead and increase the salary on the position? In my experience of having employees for many, many years, actually for a few decades, when there is a candidate that you want to hire who comes back and tells you the classification that the job should be rather than the classification that you're offering, I believe that's a red flag. One of the comments that the sheriff made, which I fully support, is We want someone to come into this position and stay with us, grow with Measure B, work with us, be here a few years. And when someone is already looking at the job classifications within the system, I believe that that job is not the classification. They will look for that classification. So we could spend a lot of time bringing somebody in, orienting them, and as soon as they find a position that's a higher level, they leave. And I don't believe that's what the Measure B committee would like. So we're back to the drawing board. We have good candidates. A salary of $80,000 a year plus county benefits, in my opinion, is a really good salary. And so, to that end, I will report next month, and hopefully by next month we will have done some reviews. Now, I think the question, and maybe the fallacy here, is that if we do not have the project the Measure B project manager, that nothing is getting done. So if you look at all the work that's getting done, the RFP process is moving forward. We are meeting to review the proposals next week. The escrow is closing on the training center. We will now be having a robust discussion on what exactly are we going to recommend for the money services versus buildings versus whatever. So I don't see where anything has stopped. We need somebody to be responsible and accountable to this committee and to the board to move forward, rather than me or my staff or anybody sitting here. And so to that end, we need a project manager. But I want to assure this committee and the public that the work is not stopped.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Is there any public expression? Seeing none, let's move on to item 3D. If you have anything further to say, Sheriff Allman, regarding discussion and possible action regarding update or purchase of regional behavioral health training center.
Yeah, thank you. So as I said earlier, the escrow is set to close on the 3rd, the day after Labor Day. The county has already done a walkthrough with possible improvements of basic improvements, removing the theater type chairs and replacing the carpet and so forth. I'm hoping that next month, I'm looking at the clerk on this one, it's going to be on the agenda anyway because it's always on the agenda, but I'm hoping to have action taken next month so we can have an approximate cost of what the rehab is going to be. It's not, as we said during the original type of this, although some people on this committee might disagree with me, it's not going to be in the several hundred thousands of dollars. I think that we're going to be able to get it set for a fairly reasonable price. But once escrow happens, once escrow closes, we'll be able to go in there and start seeing a lot more. We'll actually have it instead of having to schedule an appointment with a realtor to go in and out of a certain time period. So that's where we are. Good news is this California Post, Peace Officer Standards and Training, has confirmed that Mendocino County will be the recipient of a brand new forced option simulator, the digital device that I talked to you about last month, on training law enforcement regarding shoot, don't shoot. These are approximately $75,000 pieces of equipment, and the state has, through the new law that the chief discussed earlier on the use of force, the state has bought 50 of these units, and Mendocino County has been promised one for the second week of January. And we hope to have the regional training center up and running by then and be able to install this new piece of very essential equipment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Riley.
When we talked about the purchase of the actual building, it was a 70-30 split, 70% Measure B, 30% for the sheriff's office budget. I don't recall speaking directly about the cost of the remodel and how those costs would be split. Has that been determined, or is there anyone who is looking at that on an ongoing basis?
Well, I believe the very basic principle that the CEO and I have talked about is the regional training center would bear the cost of remodeling the regional training center, and the sheriff's office substation would be incurred by the county.
Okay, so invoices
Sure.
will be split accordingly?
Well, I don't know if there's any, I think it's two separate jobs, really.
Is it? I don't know.
Yeah, well, we haven't got in this part yet.
Yeah.
We're going to put out an RFP, and there's an expectation, certainly by the sheriff's office, that any costs incurred for the sheriff's office will be the county and the sheriff's office responsibility.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the sheriff.
Thank you very much.
Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
We'll know more next month.
Yeah.
Okay. Any desire for public expression? Seeing none, moving on to the discussion and possible action regarding update on status of the architect and RFQ and related feasibility study by Janelle.
Janelle, Executive Office, again, real quick. As mentioned in the agenda summary, the deadline for the submittals closed on the 16th of August. There were 4 responsive proposals that were received by the county. There's an evaluation panel that was identified, and a few members sitting here that are also on that panel. I believe everyone on the panel has those proposals. They will be doing a written evaluation meeting, I believe, on the 4th of September for the first time as a group to review the written proposals. From there, there is a selected date for oral panels. I don't have the date in front of me, but the evaluation panel will determine the top 1 or 2. Typically, we like to have 2 come in for oral presentations. Once those oral presentations are concluded, the evaluation panel will finalize their evaluations, tally up the totals, make the recommendation to, typically it's the purchasing agent in this particular case, as to who the number 1 responsive bidder was. And at that point, we would entertain contract negotiations, finalize it, and bring it to the board. Any questions?
Is there, I apologize, was there a possible date of when this is going to happen?
We're moving like right ahead. Written evaluations, we're meeting on the 4th.
Okay.
After that, within the next 2-week period, there's already an identified date. I just don't have it in front of me. We'll be having the oral presentations. Once we finalize that, I believe our target, I don't have it in front of me, was getting it to the board in October.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as we can hammer out a contract and get it in front of the board, that's the goal.
Right.
By board, do you mean this committee or do you mean the board of supervisors?
Board of supervisors.
And Chair, if I can just remind this committee that this committee, I'm going to say at the last meeting, they all ran together, did vote. We did have volunteers from this committee. I know Jeff is one, and Mark, were you the other volunteer? Sit on the-
Yep.
Okay. And then I think we may have 1 or 2 others.
I might have missed it, but how many applicants did you get?
4.
4 of them.
We had 11 that attended the mandatory. Of those 11, 4 presented actual proposals.
Okay,
That's what you want.
Sorry, I did not.
Is there any desire for public expression? Yes, sir.
I'm John Fremont from Fort Bragg. I'm very interested in what you're talking about, but I can only hear half of it. So I would like you to raise your voice a little bit when you speak so that we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to item 3G, discussion and possible action, including recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to utilize Measure B funds as a match to other funding streams. Mr. Martin.
So basically what this is just more exploration. I know there's a lot of funds that exist out there for help with mental health. And as we're on our own trying to wade through this labyrinth of stuff, I wanted to see if, county staff had grant writers or people that come across grants that they could apply for that would work in conjunction with Measure B. And I'd like to create a formula for them to feel free to research those things. And if we can get $10 million or $5 million of monies to help build our infrastructure, and work together in that, I think that we could be funding all of our services that we want and funding our buildings. So I just want to, I don't know how the county government works. I don't know, who finds these grants. But I know that if there's no money involved for them or benefit for them to work on behalf of Measure B, that probably isn't going to happen. So I just want to enter a discussion to see if there are people in the county staff to do that. And if we could come up with a mechanism to fund that?
So, from behavioral health, we are always looking for grants and we track them regularly. We do have some grant writers that we fund and work with when we do. Sorry. We do have some grant writers that we work with regularly if there is a grant that we apply for. We apply for a lot of grants on a regular basis. The downfall, at least in the behavioral health world for grants, is there's not a lot of funds for capital building. We can get a lot of funding for services, and then most of our grants are competitive. So you're always competing. A lot of our grants are federal, so you're competing across the United States. You do have some state grants that we do. We apply for both on a regular basis, but it still goes back to most grants do not allow for capital building, at least in the behavioral health world. We have a couple that we do have. The MHSA had the housing funding option, and then obviously we have the No Place Like Home, which is additional, but it's also focused on housing specific.
As far as the criminal justice arena and mental health goes, Governor Newsom certainly has discussed grants that are going to be clearly for criminal justice and mental health go together, offered to state sheriffs. And as an active member of the State Sheriff's Association, and we met last week, we expect by the end of this calendar year to have some opportunities from the state that are going to require a matching grant for some type of either buildings or services. And we haven't been told that buildings are off the table yet, because the governor is very aware that counties don't have the ability to have psychiatric health facilities. So I'm always looking forward to applying for a grant, and I would bring it to this committee to say we have an opportunity to turn a dime into a dollar. So it's good.
I wanted to remind everyone, if you remember, we have talked about the CHAPA grant. We have that $500,000, and that is specific for building a crisis residential treatment. So that is funds that are there as long as we spend the dollars within line with CHAPA and within their time frame. So there are small grants, but they are competitive. It's just not a lot for in our world, a lot for building.
There also is a CHAPA grant for drug and alcohol that we are going to be trying for with a lot of building that's going on between Adventist Health and RCS, RQFC. Is there a desire for public expression on this item? Yes, sir.
John Wetzler again, Little River. I spoke, I think the last meeting, maybe the meeting before, about tax credits and what our RCHDC did with Willow Terrace and how they expanded the amount of money. We had 1.4 million, and I don't know the exact figures. There's probably somebody in the room that does, but I was just touring Willow Terrace this morning, and it's certainly an amazingly very, very beautiful building they constructed, well constructed, two-story structure. This was tax credits that went for facilities. There's also tax credits that go for everything. I was hoping that Ryan LaRue was going to be here today and speak about tax credits and how they took a dime and turned it into a dollar. But it's something I think that we really have to look at, because we've got a pretty big pot of money, and they base some of the tax credits on how much you put in. So I think it's something that we need to really look at, because it was very successful for 38 units sitting down there, all done and populated right now. So that's it for me. Anybody here went to Nevada County? No one here went to Nevada County last 2 days, 3 days?
Jan didn't, she's not here.
Jan did, and Tammy did?
Jan, Tammy, and Supervisor Williams.
Okay, it's too bad. They a lot of what they did and produced would have been nice to bring to the committee today. Thank you, John.
John, when you say tax credits, you mean people donate in order to get I'm not sure how that works.
I'll bet that Lloyd can explain it. I do have a layman's understanding of it. People do good deeds to avoid paying taxes to the government. And it's things that should be, the government may or may not should be doing, but they are willing to add those monies to a project like Willow Terrace.
Yeah, and I have no experience in that, but my ears are all open and we'll certainly.
Yeah, I'm
listen to
surprised
what-
that Ryan didn't show today, but he must have been called away. But
Shannon?
I've worked on some projects using tax credits. It's through the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. It's a competitive process. It's typically for housing projects. The scoring system does tend to be based on the percentage of local match. So I think there may be opportunities because Kemper does make recommendations related to housing as well in the future for similar projects. Our CHBC is currently applying, has applied, and I think has been awarded tax credits for their proposed project on the corner of Orchard Avenue and Brush Street in Ohio, which will have a mental health component as well. Tax credits are also being used for a project over in Fort Bragg right now. So, it's a mechanism, it's competitive, and it may be an opportunity. But if, as Member Myrtle has proposed, Measure B funds could be used to match some of those funds. It could make certain applications more competitive. But it's on a case, we would just be evaluating that on a project-by-project basis, I think, more than an overarching policy.
What is RCHBC?
Rural Communities Housing Development Corporation, I believe, and they specialize in low-income and supportive housing projects throughout California. I think they have projects in a couple other states too.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
So how are these grants advertised? Is it local? Is it local to your, like, the sheriff's office, criminal justice, behavioral health? Is there a way to access those? Because we really need someone to actually look at that as part of their job description that basically can do that. And I know there's probably hundreds of those. I can talk to, I can't think of her name right now, but she worked for the city of Fort Bragg and got a lot. Jennifer Owen. Yes. So I can speak with her and see what she did to do that, but it would be helpful if we could identify a person that's familiar with that to look and research that. Because I think there are opportunities out there we may not know about.
John.
that's Ryan LaRue's job. That's what he does, day in and day out.
And also that information is typically sent directly to HHSA staff. For example, the Continuum of Care, which focuses on homeless issues, has access to that information often before it's completely published. So yeah, I think there are members of the committee or affiliations that are tied into those funding sources. They're pretty well publicized. I think what we would need to decide is if we want to make a more conscious and regular effort to participate in those.
So, there's some of us that are very unsophisticated about grants, et cetera, and so I'd be interested in a recommendation from somebody who knows more than I do about how you go about this and whether it would be worthwhile expending funds to get more funds, just like what you're talking about, and having somebody actually do this on behalf of the committee. Nice job.
I honestly think that once we get our project manager on board, this is going to be his or her main
I would think so.
focus. So we all want the exact same thing. And so, we just have to wait until then. But until then, between now and that point, I think that if there's any government grants that come up on the radar, there's several of us who work for government, we get the emails from our own grouped political bodies, whether it's CSAC or state sheriffs or the League of Cities, that are going to send it out to us. So we're watching, we're scouring.
Great. So if anybody has any recommendations of something more we can do, I think that would be good. Any other comments? So I'd like to move on to discussion and possible action regarding the report from the Kemper Report Ad Hoc Committee. Although Jan is not here today, is there anybody else on that committee that would like to report? Seeing none. Is there any public comment?
Well, I have a question on that.
Yes.
Since the Board of Supervisors yesterday took action on the Kemper report and approved it on its face, I'm wondering if, and they've asked us to do the same thing, but it's my understanding that we've already done that. My memory says we've done it.
Correct, we have.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Moving on to committee member reports. 4A regarding item, yes.
Is there public comment on
Oh,
the
sorry,
report?
please, go right ahead.
So Michelle Rich, and I just would want to echo Supervisor McGowan's comments at the beginning of the meeting in terms of making the Kemper report really a guiding document for how our mental health continuum of care system is built in the future. And I think that the Measure B committee's understanding of that report and its recommendations is key to how that impacts the facilities and programs and services that are offered along that continuum of care in the future, and just encourage the committee to really take that recommendation from the board of directors to heart.
Thank you very much. And with that comment, I would like to start the next item, which is committee member reports. Ms. Angelo and I met with Supervisor McCowan on Monday and had a discussion regarding this very issue. And I would welcome, as I said at the beginning, an agenda item on the next meeting regarding expenditure of Measure B funds toward facilities and their required services versus other services. Just in addressing Mr. McCowan's comments and those that are harbored by some of the public. So that's, and could we go on to Janine, any activities since the last meeting?
No.
Barbara?
The only thing, Chair, I would like to say is that a theme repeatedly in this meeting is that some people that are here in the room cannot hear us up here. So we could do one of two things, and we will as staff. One is we could really look at having a sign language interpreter here, which we absolutely could do if needed. The other option is we could look at having microphones.
Amen.
And it's not always easy because sometimes you have the microphones and they don't work either. So we will research both of those options, hopefully, for the next meeting.
My guess is that a lot of people who can't hear don't read sign language.
I don't know.
Ross?
So I don't have anything to report as such, but I was hopeful that we could put on next month's agenda an item to, I wanted to, when we voted to apply for, put funds available for MOPS, we kind of talked about having a way to put metrics to it and judge its efficacy. And it doesn't sound like we ended up funding any of it, but nonetheless, I think we still want to know what is its application and what is the efficacy. Is it working? To the extent it's being implemented, is it working? And then what do we need to do to help drive that forward? We voted to go implement this, and then it's not really happening. So what do we need to do to get, but that wouldn't be an agenda item for today, but I want to see that in a month. But it's not really, I'm not the one that's going to be able to bring the information to the table. Well, I hate to put that on the agenda. But everybody's always stupid, you don't know nothing. I'm good with that.
Lloyd?
I don't have anything.
Just a statement to echo kind of Michelle. NAMI at our last board meeting was talking about approaching the college to have a psych tech program only because we're gonna have buildings, et cetera. It would be nice to have something here that people could transition into an internship or a job and help alleviate our employee crisis in mental health.
I'm looking forward to next month's meeting. I do think that we definitely need to read Measure B and what his intent was before we come to next month's meeting.
Two quick things. Certainly, our MOPS team has taken a hit with Joy's retirement. Joy was a very significant part of being with MOPS from the very beginning, and now she's retired, and I know she's going to be working part-time for behavioral health in another role, but I'm counting on her to help us rebuild the MOPS team to where it is, because honestly, finding good people to go out and do this is tough to do. You know, but finding a good government employee who's going to pass a drug test and be responsible and so forth is not the easiest. It sounds easy, you know, when you talk about county benefits and so forth, but it's a very difficult task to do. And so I see that in the next 4 weeks, you'll see a push through media and so forth of finding the right people who want to be there for the right reason. And I agree with the CEO, and I've written in my notes for some type of enhanced speaker mechanism up here. I know there's a cost involved with that. You know, it might be $1,000 or so, but I know that we have an administrative cost with cost of preparing our notebooks and so forth that is reimbursed to the CEO's office. There's no
reimbursement.
But we have reimbursed for some things. I'm also going to look to see if we have some type of speaker system where we can portable use it in this room, and it would not only be used for the video.
Yeah, Sheriff, we're gonna go ahead and go to IT and see what they
Okay.
have. So if we
Thank
don't
you.
have anything, then I'll ask you. But
All right.
if we have the equipment and we have staff to set it up every month, we can use it.
All right, thank you. That's it for me.
Sure.
Yeah, I just, I don't have any report, but comment on the same thing. You know, we go out of our way to try to involve the community, and I think there's nothing more frustrating as a community person, having been on both sides, to come to a meeting and be interested and be sitting and spend 2 hours and not be able to hear a lot of what's said. So I think whatever it takes, and if we gotta spend some money of our funds to do that, I think it's a worthwhile expenditure to really do what we say we're gonna do, which is include the community at least being able to hear what we're saying, and we be able to hear them when they speak.
We just need your booming voice.
Well, I know, but not everybody
Everybody have our voice.
The podium should be facing the people, not give the back to the people. The podium should be in front of the people.
Thank you.
Then you can hear better.
Now, there's one more agenda item that I'm not quite sure the city clerk ran ad hoc.
That was just correspondence. That was just saying what the correspondence was. We're done with all of the agenda items, and I don't know if our assistant chief counsel had any comments.
No, I don't think so.
Just thought I'd ask.
And can we ask for one more public comment, Carol?
Hi, thank you. Carol Hester. Y'all are doing great. You're working hard. This is great. Thank you. Commendations. Is there, and I loved your, whoever was talking about the tech training. Oh, NAMI, thank you. And all that. Another step that occurred to me, are y'all developing a computer system where you all talk to each other? Hospital rooms, the law enforcement's, any of the behavioral health and the mental health, a centralized and communication that, oh, here he is again, and this is what we did last time, and you know, I know there's privacy issues and all of that, but if we could train people to stay here and get some jobs going, we also need to have the ability to, y'all, the whole county, to communicate with one another and say, here we go, this is an emergency. It's like we don't have anything in place to tell us when a fire is coming our way, you know? I'm ready to buy a $25,000 siren is what I'm ready to do. Anyway, so I just wondered if y'all have thought about that component in your trainings and things like that.
You don't mind? So you'll be happy to know that the Sheriff's Office and Behavioral Health and our hospitals, once we've, and River Quality, once we've cleared the certain HIPAA guidelines per person, so it's not a blanket policy, but per person, yes, there's communication happening as we speak right now. So being able to access medical records by trained professionals is something we've had online for about 3 years.
Would that be also in a going out to meet them where they are type of thing?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that's confidential, cryptic computer stuff.
Yeah.
So are you talking about interfaces or a specific platform, like EDIE, I know is used?
Well, in the jail, when a person comes in and there's medical records, once they clear the HIPAA guidelines and we can get the medical records from Adventist or from wherever, and they can get ours, because it's the same person, just different location, different treating physician. So, but it's a good question regarding mobile. I don't know, but you have to have the qualified person to be able to obtain that information.
As part of the big thing we did with whole person care, as it came out, was create a universal database that we are using. I don't remember, Dan, the name. It's like the V, vertical change. And that is a system that, as long as we get a release of information, which is required per HIPAA to release any client information, it allows multiple agencies to be able to access that. So the hospitals, the homeless shelter, mental health, I think NAFCare can actually access it too from the jail. So there's several agencies, and we keep expanding it, and everybody within the whole person care system. So as they get a client in, the client signs the ROI, they get put into the system. That allows anybody, if they walk into the hospital, you can pull up and see that this person is receiving services and where they're receiving services, and the hospital then putting in there too.
So does this require that the hospital have vertical change software?
They do, yes.
They do?
Yeah, you kind of do.
Okay, all right, thank you. That brings us to the close of the meeting. Do we have oh yes, please, public comment?
I didn't know where to put this in. Joe Bradley, Public, Little River. And if you can't hear me, throw something at me. Just a couple of house cleaning things, just sitting here listening to all this. And I don't know if, because Sandra's new, we didn't get any board packets here in the room, or we didn't get emails for letting us know about the meeting. I just had a calendar and I had it on it. So where there is a distribution list for those of us in the public that have asked to get those ahead.
I'll double check. My understanding they were sent out, but I'll double check on it.
Yeah. You got yours? Okay, because two of us didn't get ours, so.
You might want to check your spam filters.
I do, multiple times during the day. So that was one of the things. I like Mark's idea of reading Measure B again. My understanding of Measure B is that it's for the brick and mortar with 25% going toward training, which we use some of that training money to a brick and mortar building. How that's used, I don't know, but I'm hearing all this wonderful stuff, but there needs to be like a steering committee that is not this board, because this board has stipulated things that it has to do. I don't know where it would be, but I really think that you guys being all informed is good, but putting money toward things that are not in Measure B is not a good idea, because then you'll get the public and the people that voted for it will start getting upset. That was one thing, and including the community, I think is really, really important. I've just been through a horrific 6 months with my son, who thankfully is stable at the moment. But the thing that's really important is talking to community, and I'm on the coast. People, I keep getting, we don't know what's going on, we don't know what's going on. And some of them want it spoon-fed, I get that, But just being able to say, well, if you go and look at this, you'll be able to see what's going on, or whatever your group is doing, I think would help, because the homeless thing, the mental health thing is, it impacts a lot of people on a day-to-day basis. And then the other day I had the opportunity of talking to a homeless man that my son had interacted with here in Ukiah, and he had no idea how to get himself services. Now, I don't know how much of that was him just telling me that because he wanted my sympathy, or because he really didn't know. So, I mean, that's not up to this committee. This committee will have a brick and mortar building that person could go to at some point. But
You're talking about the homeless person?
this gentleman had mental issues also.
There's a place like that already. They just built building bridges, a homeless resource center. It was RCS built that.
Okay, all right.
It's on Thomas and State Street.
Okay, see, and if I'd known about that myself, I'd have directed him there. I directed him to Social Security. He was complaining about that, and he was talking about crisis, and I directed him to your facility. So, but I'm just saying, we need to communicate, and I did write down a note that at some point, maybe our new building can act as a meeting place where all these groups can get together and make decisions and direct and have things actually be more cohesive as opposed to static. And that may be down the road. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. We'll adjourn.
All right. See you next month.
Thank you.
So